Welcome to the first episode of Insights via Bach. My name is Mark Edwards. I'm a harpsichordist, organist, and historical keyboardist, and I will be your host over this series of educational videos focused on the music of J.S. Bach. This mini-series of videos is part of the larger Via Bach project, whose aim is to publish high-quality video recordings of the complete keyboard works of J.S. Bach over the course of the next 500 weeks. Each week, we'll revisit the piece that was performed in last week's video. And for each one of these pieces, we'll ask the really important question, what can we learn from this piece? What can we take away from it as keyboardists, as musicians, as interested listeners? Today, we begin with one of the most famous pieces of all Bach's works. This is the Prelude, number 1, in C major, from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, Book I. Let's hear how this piece begins. In discussing this particular piece, there are lots of areas we could focus our attention on. There are lots of terms that we could unpack. For example, what does the term well-tempered mean with respect to keyboard tuning? What does clavier or keyboard mean with respect to Bach's own keyboard preferences? I promise that these are questions that I will answer in future weeks. But for now, I want to concentrate on just the prelude. I want to figure out what makes this piece tick. And when I say what makes this piece tick, I mean, how does it work musically? How is it put together? How is it organized? But beyond that, how does it tick for us as musical listeners? How do we understand the content of the piece? And how does it move us emotionally? I have a provisional answer for these questions, and that answer is harmony and voice leading. This piece is actually what's normally referred to as a figuration prelude. That's a kind of piece where we have a harmonic progression running through the piece, which is embellished by the composer or player by applying a consistent keyboard figuration from bar to bar. And so what might at first glance appear to just be simple block chords ends up sounding like a more complicated keyboard texture. Bach preserved an early version of the piece in his Klavierbüchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, Wilhelm Friedemann being his eldest son. And so what you see in the piece is the first several bars are written out in totally explicit notation, shows exactly how the figuration works that we recognize from the beginning of the C major prelude. But then at a certain point, he just writes block chords. He just shows blocks of harmony that are meant to be embellished in the same way as the example he's already shown. So at this instance, it's a little bit like Bach is saying to his son, okay, so you see how this works. Now you fill in the rest yourself. So that's how harmony ends up being at the core of this piece. But what about voice leading? Voice leading literally is the way that different musical lines that form the various parts of a musical progression operate together to form a cohesive whole. Voice leading is something that Bach would have understood naturally as part of thoroughbase. So what is thoroughbase? Well, it's something we're going to talk about a whole lot through the course of these videos, so we should learn about it. Thoroughbase goes by a bunch of different names. You'll hear it called basso continuo. You'll hear it called figured bass. But in essence, they're all basically the same thing. The idea was that the keyboard player, rather than necessarily playing from a written out keyboard part, instead read from a bass line. And the bass line could have numbers called figures that appear above or below the bass that indicate to the player musical intervals that need to be played above the bass. So in essence, these figures, these numbers, are showing the musician the harmonies that have to be played over top of the bass. So playing thoroughbase was an extremely practical skill for any keyboardist. If they wanted to accompany a solo violinist or a chamber ensemble or an orchestra, they would be reading a figured bass, having to make sense of the harmonies and realize them correctly with good voice leading. So, how can we learn to play thoroughbase? If we want to understand how Bach's music works, I think this is something we have to dig into. Happily, Bach presents us with some lessons in thoroughbase. There is a treatise from Bach's Circle. It could be by Bach, but we're not 100% sure. In any case, it's very closely connected with J.S. Bach, and it's called Precepts and Principles. And the bulk of it is taken up by a variety of bass progressions that are meant to be learned by the keyboard player and mastered. So, as luck would have it, one of the bass progressions, number 13 in fact, that Bach presents in this Precepts and Principles is exactly the same bass progression that undergirds the entire prelude in C major. We have one progression that repeats over and over again. Happily, it's printed in C major, which is the same key as our prelude, so we should be able to understand what's going on here. And what we see happening is we have a C in the bass. There's no figure at all over top of that C, so that tells the keyboard player that they need to play what's called an 8-5-3 chord, or a root position chord. Don't worry, by the way, if you don't understand what any of these figured bass terms mean. Over the course of the following weeks, we'll get really familiar with all of them. So after the initial root position chord, we have the figure 4-2. 4-2 is actually shorthand usually for 6-4-2. And so that tells the keyboard player literally that they need to play the intervals of a sixth, a fourth, and a second, or a ninth, above the bass. So that means that the bass is a C, and over top of that, we have 6, A, 4, F, and 2, D. There are a lot of dissonances in this chord. Both the fourth and the second are dissonant with respect to the bass. So the effect that's created here is what's called a bass suspension. The bass stays put, it stays on C, while the harmony over top of the bass shifts. And in hearing that change in harmony over top of the bass, all of a sudden the bass has a different feeling. The bass is no longer grounding and consonant, but is instead tense, unstable, and dissonant. And so what happens then is the bass resolves down by step to B, and Bach accompanies that B with a 6 chord, which is a first inversion triad, or if we're thinking about intervals, we have at least the 6th and the third above the bass. And after this happens, you see that Bach puts another 4/2 on top of the B this time, meaning that our consonant B is now dissonant and it has to resolve down in turn. And this progression repeats step by step through the bass. For Bach, it seems, it was important to be able to realize bass progressions like this in 4 voices. So that's what I'll present now. I'll show how we might realize this figured bass in 4 voices. So how is the voice leading working in this example? Well, one of the principles that I'm trying to follow is one that Bach also seems to have recommended, which is to move the right hand as little as possible. Notice that the right hand is either sustaining the same note that it held previously, or when the harmony changes, it's moving by step to the next nearest chord tone. It isn't leaping all around the keyboard. This really smooth voice leading is part of what creates the singing effect of the realization of the thoroughbase. So notice that this pattern of suspending the bass and resolving it down by step with dissonant 6/4-2 chords is exactly what Bach uses to drive forward his prelude in C major. Let's listen to just a little bit of that. Okay, so now we have a rough idea about how figuration preludes work, that we have block harmonies that can be embellished in real time using some kind of fancy keyboard figuration. It might just be a basic arpeggio. And we have a basic understanding of thoroughbase, which is the way that we actually generate the harmonies and voice leadings over top of the bass that make the music happen. So we're now at a point where, if you wanted, you could begin to personalize this prelude in C major to make it your own. You could almost imagine thinking about Bach's early copy for his son, that at the bottom he said something like, "And now why don't you try writing your own?" And all you really need to do this is choose a different figuration to apply. So I thought I would show you a couple of different figurations that might sound nice. And we're also going to do this in 4 voices. Notice that in Bach's original, he's actually working in 5 voices. He's got 5 voice chords. And working in 5 voices makes voice leading a little bit more complicated than we necessarily want to deal with. So we'll reduce this to 4 voices, but still come up with some really nice sounding figurations that we could use. So I'll present 2 possibilities here. The first is really, really simple and basically just involves playing the bass and then arpeggiating up through the right hand to play the rest of the chord. I'll show here over top exactly the voice leading that I'm using. Basically, I'll write out the block chords that Bach might have included in his copy for his son. But keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to use exactly this voice leading, and you could come up with different voice leading in the right hand that might work just as well. And that's why learning thoroughbase is really useful. We could also imagine a slightly more intricate pattern in the right hand. This one might involve repeating some of the notes of the chord in the right hand at various points. I think this is a really fantastic exercise for pretty much any musician. If you're a keyboardist, obviously you can do this really easily at the keyboard, but even if you're, say, a violinist or a flautist or an oboist or any kind of instrumentalist, you can do this as well, because all of us can play arpeggios. And so all we need to do is play the bass and then arpeggiate up through a chord. And what we have at the end of it is a figuration prelude, personalized for us. So we finally have all of the pieces that are necessary to understand what's going on in this prelude by Bach. And I think it's important to understand these things because not only does it make it easier to play the piece expressively, but for listeners, it also means that we have something to grasp onto as we're listening to the piece. We noticed when we looked at the thoroughbase, it made it crystal clear that the piece operates according to patterns of tension and release. We have dissonant 6/4-2 chords that resolve down by step to consonant 6 chords. And so, as listeners, if we can pay attention to these things, it's almost as if Bach is leading us by the hand from the beginning of the piece to its conclusion.